Hey guys, this is Stef from Samayas and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to go deep into the iDRAC8 settings of the 13th gen Dell servers. For this I'll be using a Dell R630 and a Dell R930. The iDRAC settings for most servers are more or less the same, with the exception of inserted components like RAID cards, network cards, etc. So let's dig in. So when I first serve to my iDRAC, this is what I get. Of course, I've already modified my DNS to map the IP address of my iDRAC to the DNS name I want, and I had to look in my firewall which IP address my iDRAC received. So if we go to Advanced and we have a look at the certificate, we are receiving a standard Dell certificate, which at this time is still valid, but as of next year won't even be valid. So we should just accept it. And then we get this logon screen. So I was lucky that I got the enterprise version. However, there are three different versions. First, you have the basic version. You only have access via the local console. You have no remote GUI access. Basic hardware monitoring is limited to BIOS and local LCD screen, if any. You have no dedicated remote management port. There's no virtual media or KVM access. And there's no integration with any management tools. But each server gets that basic version. Then, the version which is more plausible is the iDRAC Express. You have a basic GUI, you have a network access through a shared interface, you have basic remote monitoring and alerting via IP, you can put it on, off and reset remotely, you have some event logging, and you have limited IPMI access. But you don't have any KVM access. And finally you have the enterprise version, which is everything in the Express, plus you have a dedicated NIC for your iDRAC. You do have a virtual console, which is in HTML5 or Java. You have virtual media, you have the full lifecycle manager, you have remote OS monitoring, and you have Dell Enterprise Management, Redfish and tools. Now in order to log in, it's very complex. You have a root and you have a password which is Calvin, C-A-L-V-Y-N. I press submit, and since this is the default password, it automatically asks you if you want to change the password or keep the current password. Since we're in demo mode, we'll leave it and we'll just select keep it current. So now we're logged in into our iDRAC. Again, this is a quite old server and the UI is accordingly to what was the standard at that time. So now we are on the main summary page of the iDRAC8 and we have a number of distinct blocks. First, we have a server health, which gives you a status of a server, and in my server I have no issues. If your server has an issue, instead of having a small green box with a V, you will have a small red box with an X. So as you can see, my batteries are fine, my fans are fine, I have no intrusion problems, my power supplies are okay, my removable flash media is okay, my temperature okay, and my voltage is okay. So I quickly went to the server and I opened it. And as you can see, you have a nice little red X on intrusion. If you click through an intrusion, well, you see the chassis is open. I've closed it again, and as you can see, everything is back to normal. The second most important block, if you want to remotely manage if your server is running, is your virtual console preview. And here we have settings, we have the refresh. If I press refresh, you will have a small screen of what is happening on the screen of your server. Well, since it's just a console of something which is logged in, you don't see a lot, and you just have a log-on screen of my Proxmox server. The next block is more the server information. My power state, my server is on. I'm on a Dell R630, which is revision. I have a system host name which I could never really change. The operating system if it can identify it. The operation version if it can identify it. My service tag, an express code, the latest BIOS version, the latest firmware, my current IP address, the MAC address, the DNS name I've already assigned to it, the lifecycle BIOS name, and the location which I specified, and the license. And also an important block is the quick launch menu. If you have an issue and for whatever reason your server might have been crashed, well, this power on or off, or this power cycle, is something which is very handy. Next, we also have the system ID LED on and off. When I reviewed the hardware of the Dell R630, I had a physical button which I could press for on and off. Well, here I can do it virtually. I can just come into the server, I can click and then somebody in the data center itself can identify the server which is having an issue. You might have specified correctly in location, but you might just have specified it is in rack 224. And it's very handy to know that it's the second or the 24th position for the server if you have a full rack with all the same servers. Next you have logs, you have update and rollback. And finally we have a small overview screen of our recent events. And so as you can see, today at multiple times did I open and close my chassis. And I also removed a number of drives. So if I now click through on my details of my server, I will have more details of my current server. And here we have a little bit more details than that we had already in the previous block. We also have our different NICs which are installed with the MAC addresses. We have also more specific information about remote access. We have IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. And we have the system location, which we can specify, the data center name. I can specify the aisle, the rack number, the slot, the room, etc. Something you will notice is that specific blocks have specific applies. And sometimes you have more than one block with more than one different apply. And you can change something here, but if you don't press the apply, it isn't applied. So let's do an apply on the data name. And if I go back to my summary, my data center has been updated. So the first two blocks are informative. The third block is configuration, which you can modify yourself. And the next part then is the system summary, which is also very interesting. In essence, it gives you detail of all components installed on one page on your server. Also which firmwares are installed. So for instance, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 DIMMs. And I have some very detailed information about the DIMMs. Now, somehow this is duplicated, which what we'll see later, with the hardware section here. I have two CPUs and it retrieves all information about the CPU. And as you can see, it identifies even the fans. You can see at what speed they're running, but here is just a general information. And very important, you can export it. Now let's look at the attached media. In the virtual console, I've temporarily attached an ISO. And now you can see that the connection state has changed to connected. If I unmap it, after a refresh, it's not connected anymore. Under normal circumstances, when we are in the console, we have the possibility to map a virtual ISO. But mapping the virtual ISO itself is not enough. When we reboot, out of the box the server will reboot automatically with the default boot menu, as long as that's still valid. Once we boot, we can press F11 to go and override that setting and temporarily boot to our virtual ISO drive. However, by flagging the enabled boot once, that happens out of the box. And so automatically, when our server reboots one time, it will go to our predefined ISO and afterwards it will continue to the normal boot process. We also have a floppy emulation. Since this is an older system, potentially years ago, some systems in order to boot needed to boot through a floppy system, and we can still emulate that. The virtual media encryption is really something that depends. And I'd say in essence, in general, you won't need it. The virtual media encryption is something that I guess that these days you won't really need anymore. First, when connecting to the virtual console, currently you have, as I see it, two options, either the Java or HTML5. And even Java for me these days seems obsolete. So I guess that most modern browsers will connect to HTML5. When they connect to HTML5, they use HTTPS. And even then, in general, 99.9% when you will be connecting to a server like that, you'll be in a secure corporate environment where there will not really be any e-speaking. Plus, you'll be running on HTTPS, and you will only be in 1% of situations where you might really be in a catastrophic situation and you have to expose temporarily your server to the internet and to connect over an unsecure line, be able to reinstall that server. But that's a very rare scenario. Now, if we look to the virtual media in general, there are 5 different scenarios. First, we have the virtual console, and that is using TCP 5900 for the keyboard, video and mouse. Next, we have what they call the virtual media legacy, which is for legacy access and IPMI, and that is using port 623. The next virtual media access is port 5120, and that's more for Java or ActiveX. And then finally, the virtual console and media through HTML5 just uses HTTPS port 443 and WebSockets. And then for some kind of media sharing, if you would be using ISOs via NFS or GIFs or SMB, then you might be using port 2049, port 111 and port 137 to 139. So even though this is an older server, I guess nowadays you'll just connect over HTTPS and you'll be using port 443. And then we also have the option auto attach. Depending on the virtual media, whether or not you use a remote file share or you use the connect virtual media in the remote console, it will on next connection reconnect your ISO so that the system could use it again. That's for you to see which version is best. And so again, if we are in admin mode, as a root user, we could pre-configure an ISO here, and then somebody who has less rights has still access to some kind of ISO, but only to that, and cannot change or attach anything else. And here we can connect to GIFs SMB or NFS. Next off, we have a vFlash. vFlash is a feature which is only available in the enterprise version, and it refers to a dedicated SD card slot on the iDRAC controller. vFlash stands for Virtual Flash Media. What can we do with it? Well, we can insert bootable media, we can use it as log storage, we can use it for scripting and automation, we can use it for tech support and for remote servicing. And we can choose whether or not we want to enable or disable it. If you're in a scenario where you have 4, 5, 10, 200 of those Dell R630s and still want to reinstall it, then the vFlash in combination with scripting is the way to go. Next off, we have the service module. The iDRAC service module, or the ISM, is an optional lightweight software agent that runs inside the OS, not just any OS. OSs which are supported currently are Windows Server, Red Hat, CentOS, Ubuntu, ESXi. Unfortunately, Proxmox is not. And so in essence, it extends the iDRAC capabilities by building a bridge between the OS and the iDRAC and providing additional monitoring, automation, manageability. So first we can see the OS we have installed. Since on this one we have Proxmox, he doesn't know. Then we have the connection status of the OS, it's not running. We can choose whether or not to disable the service host OS running or not. And then it can retrieve OS information. It can replicate all of the log entries from the Dell directly in the OS, and so the OS monitoring log can pick it up as well. WMI information can be shared. The auto system recovery action, if we have an integration between the OS and iDRAC, if for some reason your OS might crash and after a number of seconds, which is predefined here, the lifeline between both is going down, well then your server might decide to reboot and try to recover. This is also something we see like a heartbeat on a lot of network devices. If there's no link between the OS and the iDRAC, he doesn't know, and so he can't intervene. And so the allow service model to perform the iDRAC hard reset is the other way around. Suppose that the OS is detecting that the iDRAC has crashed, he can reset the iDRAC. And then next, when we enable the SNMP alerts via hostOS and get via hostOS, events generated on the iDRAC are extended to the hostOS. The SS event correlation is there to reduce the alert noise, and it tries to correlate system events with iDRAC events in the position that both are connected. And lastly, the system SATA supported for SATA drives will transmit again SATA information to the underlying OS if it's connected. Technically on this server, since I'm only running Proxmox, I should deflag everything because it doesn't work. Now I switch to my iDRAC on my Dell R930, which has a Windows Server installed on it, and there, even though it's off right now, you can clearly see it has identified the version which is installed. So after having booted my Windows Server, you can see there's a link, so it's running. If we quickly switch over to that server, we see the DSM iDRAC service module is running. If I come back to my service module, while my Dell R930 is now running ESXi, the host version is changed, it's still running. And if I switch to my ESXi, it's identified it's a Dell R930, it has the BIOS version, it has a serial number. If I go to my system sensors, I can see all my power supplies. I can clearly see that 3 of the 4 power supplies are in red because they're simply not connected, and everything else is green. I can see each of the memory modules. I can see my CPU. I can see a lot of information. The last strange duck in the row on the system is the job. Here you have an overview of each and every process that might be updated on your system. It's configuration option, firmware updates, etc. Next off we have the logging. We have all the events. I reinsert the disk and that's okay. I remove the number of disks and it becomes red. I close the chassis. I open the chassis. I remove the power from the power supply, and so it gives all the system information. The OEM event filtering enabled flag or disabled allows you to log extra OEM messages from a BMC, from internal firmware, from sensor calibration, etc. You can leave it on or you can leave it off. It reduces the noise to clutter information. Next off we have the settings. Of course, any good system can log to a syslog server. I have not configured any, but in general most corporations which have networking infrastructure also have somewhere a syslog server. And finally here you can export by type, critical, warning or information, all, only system health, only storages, etc. and or specify a from and to. Next we have our power and thermal settings. First we have a general status block which shows the health of the system, which shows the health of the server status, which shows the current watt usage and the maximum capacity, which shows whether or not the power supplies are in redundancy mode or not, and which shows the active cap which is put in place. And nicely hidden here as well, we have a little drop down where we can power off the system, we can gracefully shut down, do a hard reset, do a cold reboot, or an unmasked interrupt. Now you have to select one and then press apply. The second block shows your current power consumption. And currently this server is using 112 watts. It's capped at 500 watts and you can see the usage for the last hour, last day or last week. And you can switch between watt and amp. The following block allows you to set a warning threshold and a failure threshold, both in watt and in BTU per hour, which you can apply. And then next you can see I have two PSUs, which are both using 0.2 watt on 232 volts. And then finally my cumulative watt usage, because it's an old server and I haven't reset, is of 6561 kilowatt. I could reset it. Then you have an overview of the most recent peak and you see a difference between peak in watt and peak in amp. And finally again you have last hour, last day, last week. Of course power monitoring would be nothing if you wouldn't be able to configure it. So now let's go to power configuration. Here again we have the power control, the same menu we had before: power on, power off, MNI reboot, graceful shutdown, reset and power cycle. And the second block allows us to configure the system. And we can choose to cap or not. That depends on in what system your server is installed. Since these are older systems, in general there would be home run systems. But even then, if you want to limit the maximum use, you could put limit here. So in here we have quite a number of options. So let's look at the power options. First, we have our redundancy policy. Whether or not our power supplies are in redundant mode or in not redundant mode. The second option, hot spare, defines whether or not one of both PSUs is considered a hot spare or not. And once we enable that, we can even designate which one is a hot spare. So in my current demo setup, I have put in two power cables to both PSUs, so that you can clearly see that both PSUs are drawing power. In my normal setup, I am in not redundancy mode and I have only one PSU running. Since this is a test server, I don't need any hot spare and I don't mind it crashing. Another reason, loads of those servers are only sold with one PSU, and you might not necessarily buy a second PSU. If you want to run this system with only one PSU, you have to configure it in non-redundant mode. If you leave your two PSUs in, but you don't provide a power cable to one of both, your iDRAC will show you an error. Now, if you're in a real production server, in general, in 90% of the cases, you will go in redundant mode and you will designate a hot spare. There's only one reason to go into not redundancy mode, and that's if, for instance, you have two 450 watt power supplies and your system requires more power. And if you're not redundant mode, in essence you have access to 900 watts of power. Now if you have two PSUs running at the same time, your system will be slightly using more power than if you only have one PSU with or without a spare. And then finally, power factor correction ensures that your PSU draws efficiently from the wall, and it tries to have a good balance between watt and parent power. Modern PSUs typically use the active PFC, which reduces electrical loss, helps stay within the power grid regulations, and reduces the strain on the UPS. The next block is our voltages, and this is just a status page where you might see if a CPU or some other component might have some issues. And then finally we have the temperature probes. We have the two CPU probes, we have the system board exhaust temperature probe and the system board Intel temperature probe. And only for the system board can we define minimum and maximum values, which we can apply. The second block gives us an overview of the temperature usage of a year, of a month, or of today. And that again can be exported to an XML or to CSV. Next, we have a specific tab which allows us to configure our virtual console. We also have an explicit direct link. If we go to the server homepage and we click here on settings, we just end up on the same page. We can enable or disable it. We can specify the maximum of number of connections at the same time. We can see the number of active connections. We can specify a potential remote port. As we've seen before, port 5900 is used for KVM. And again, this remote port is only used for Java ActiveX. And it's the same thing. The video encryption is again not used for HTML5, so I can just disable it. The next option is quite interesting. In some server setups, on one side somebody can connect a local monitor, on the other side you might be connecting remotely, and some information might be shown which should not be shown on a local monitor. So if you want to, when taking over control from a virtual control and unflagging this flag, then when you're doing something on your virtual control, somebody with a physical monitor can't see anything anymore. But that depends on the option. In my scenario, I leave it enabled. In a lot of data centers, you might disable that. And then finally, default action upon session sharing request timeout, which has default access denied, read-only access, or default full access. By default, it denies access. Again, that depends on the number of users which will be connecting to your server and or the number of maximum allowed connections. Again, if this server is in production, you have multiple people managing it, that might be a good option. Since this is a quite old server, the probability that multiple users will be connecting to this server at the same time is very slim. And the automatic system log will automatically, after some time, if there's inaction, request for a password again. And then finally, we have the keyboard mouse attach state. I leave it in auto attach, but you also have to attach or detach. If it's detached, you need to explicitly attach a keyboard. However, I don't really know in any scenario why you would have it in detached mode. If you just don't need it, you just disconnect the console. But hey. So in the iDRAC, you just clicked on your virtual console launch, you get this view. This is basically a view of your server, as if you had a physical monitor, keyboard and mouse. This server is currently empty and we're going to install Proxmox on it. So the first thing which we're going to do is click on the virtual media, and here we can map a floppy or a CD-ROM or DVD. Well, since the server is quite old, floppy might have been a thing at that time, but currently isn't really anymore. So I'll just select the ISO of Proxmox, I click on map, and you can see that in the left box on the top, you now have one map device, and I've mapped Proxmox v8.4.1. Now just close this box and then launch, do a power on, power off in my iDRAC, and then this server will start up. And so immediately when the power on happened, the boot sequence starts. This might take a while, of course. Depending on the server you have, an R630 or an R730 or an R930, that boot sequence might take up more time. Also, depending on the number of extra devices you have, the initialization takes up more time. Well, the moment it shows you this menu, we have to go to the boot manager, because we don't want them to boot normally. In this scenario, this won't be an issue because there's nothing on there which is bootable. But in other systems, there might still be old system lingering around. Even though everything has been reset, this device still has a notion of previous booted OSs, which I played around with. Now that it enters in the boot menu, I can choose between a continue normal boot or a one-shot UEFI. So I choose the one-shot UEFI boot menu. And here you can clearly see I've tried a number of previous OSs, but everything has been cleaned out. And for this setup, I will choose the virtual optical drive, which is mapped to my Proxmox. And now it will boot just as if there's a local USB or CD-ROM drive in there. You can remotely control your device this way from anywhere in the world. And you can also remotely install it. However, if you have a slow connection on one side and on the other side you try to upload a 1 or 2 GB ISO file, that might take a while. The next option, Alerts, allows you to tweak your server very nicely, and this is only available in the enterprise version. And depending on each of those errors, you can send out and or do a number of actions. For instance, you have amperage issues, you have battery issues, you have cabling issues, and for each of those you have severity, just an information, a warning or an error. And then based on those types, you can decide whether or not you want to send an email or an SNMP trap or an IPMI alert or just a remote system log, a WS event, an OS log, etc. A redfish event. And then for each of the actions you might also specify an action. Power off, to power cycle, to reboot, or to do nothing. And this list is quite long. And so out of the box, a lot of events have been configured. I haven't tuned anything here, I've just left the default. Now if you don't want to be informed, of course you could just not fill in the emails and you won't receive anything. SNMP trap is push, IPMI is push, OS log only works in case you have an OS which is supported, redfish, events you need to be listening. That's up to you. And you can also explicitly remove the storage configuration, etc. For this to work, of course, you need to configure SNMP and email. So once we're in the SNMP trap and email settings, in essence, an SNMP trap will be sent out to a network monitoring server, or an IPMI trap will be sent out to an IPMI managing station. But that means that you already have infrastructure in place. Also pay attention, those are different blocks here, and if you want to change something, you need to apply each of those specifically. If you do two things at the same time and you press apply, the second one is lost. If I want to have access to my SNMP v3 users here, I first need to enable SNMP v3, otherwise it's grayed out, as you can see. Furthermore, there's not really any user here, I can't add any, and if I want to add any, I need to use the rack admin command line tool to create some. Finally, I can specify a number of email addresses and or an SMTP server. And the SMTP server can be anonymous, or I can enable username and password and authentication. I can also specify a port should it not be running on a standard port. Then we have the alert recurrences. In order not to overload a system, by default it will not send out retries in the next 30 days. And finally, redfish has a separate tab for settings, where it specifies the maximum number of retries, maximum timeout, and whether or not to ignore client certificates. So next we have some troubleshooting options for the server. The identify server in the checkbox is again the same thing that if we check it, the server lights front and back will start blinking. Plus here we can specify the timeout, ping for 30 seconds, ping for 6 minutes. As the documentation explains it, the diagnostic console mode and diagnostic console command settings are part of a sub troubleshooting and remote support features. These options are primarily used by Dell support engineers for out-of-band situations. You might need this if a system hangs or if there's some firmware issues, but in general I don't think you'll use them. So postcode, in case your system crashes or won't boot, might identify what the issue is. OX7E means that the system handed everything over to the UEFI BIOS, and so there was no problem. If the system is crashed, again, we might see the last crash screen for diagnostics. I didn't have any. And finally, you even have a video cap. And so here, you might choose to disable it. You might choose to buffer until the end of post, until your buffer is full. And so here you can see latest reboots. And so in essence, if you want to play around with that, in case of issues, that might also be helpful. But on one side, the file you download has an extension of a DLC. And on the other side, you need to download a video player, which is a Java player. And I don't have any Java on my system, but in case of issues that might be quite helpful. And this is a quite old system, and I guess most of those systems won't even be in support anymore. The supporter systems and the Dell support, I think, are quite useless. Under the licenses tab you can see what license your system has. I haven't tried it and I don't have any experience with it, but I read a lot of articles stating that even if you have an Express version, that you might be able to upgrade it to an enterprise. And probably here, by inserting a license, you can do something about it. If you go to the hardware section, we have a small overview. Batteries are okay, the removable flash media is okay, the fans are okay, CPU is okay, memory is okay, and power supply. We have a little stat screen about our system performance. We have some system performance history, which we can reset if you want to. And again, we have some metrics. Next, we have an overview whether or not our battery has an issue. Next, we can see all the fans in our system, the speed at which they're running, the thermal profile which has been chosen in the BIOS. We can even configure an offset should that be needed. And it calculates the number of cubic feet per minute that airflow is happening. And should the need arise, we can also change the fan speed. We can override our profile from default to maximum performance or to minimum power. We can tweak our default from 70 degrees to only 50 degrees if you want to. We can specify a fan offset, which means that if the fan is at X%, it adds X%, meaning that the fan will run faster, or we can manually override that. In a data center, we don't care, and we want the server to be as cool as possible. In a home environment, the higher this gets, the more noise it makes, the more annoying it gets. And so I prefer my server to be a little bit warmer and making a little less noise, but that's just me. Again, this server is not running 24/7, it's only running when I need it. Next we have CPU settings, it shows you the CPU in the system and all the details associated with the CPU. And then we have the memory configuration. I have currently 8 DIMMs of 16 GB, 4 per processor, which are running at 2133, which is a total of 128 GB, and this server has a max capacity of 3 TB. Then I have my front panel configuration. Here again I can see if my LED is blinking or not. I can have a custom LCD setting, which is displayed if there's no error. I also have a number of other options which I could choose. The service tag, the asset tag, the iDRAC MAC or IPv4 or IPv6, the system power, the ambient temperature, the system model, the host name, or like here, the user defined. And then finally here I can choose to have it blink off, blink on, blink for 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. I don't know who would use the 1 week or 1 month, but hey. And then we get our network devices. For our Dell R630, it's quite easy. I have one integrated NIC, which has 2 RJ45 and 2 SFP+ ports. So the network I/O identifier optimization is a feature specifically made for virtualization platforms like ESXi, Hypervisor, Proxmox, etc. It ensures consistent network interface identifiers like MAC addresses and port mappings, and it avoids unexpected network reordering or renaming in case of a reboot or reordering of the network card. It also optimizes network I/O performance under certain firmwares or virtualization configurations. So if this feature would not be enabled, imagine you boot your ESXi or Proxmox and now your VMI C0 becomes VMI C1, and there goes your whole configuration. And this flag ensures that your VMI C0 or C1 is still the same network port from the same network card, even after reboot. So now let's look at our network card. We have our integrated NIC, and here we can see that we have the 4th port which is up and all the rest are down. We can see the MAC addresses for each of them, we can see how the card is configured, etc. If I have the same overview on my Dell R930, it's a little bit more interesting, because I have different NICs. My first NIC is an Intel 10G card with 2 interfaces. My second NIC has also 2 interfaces, and my third NIC has 4 interfaces. Now let's look at the power supplies. And in my R630, I have 2 power supplies which are connected at a maximum of 495 watts. In the R930, I have 4 power supplies with a maximum of 1100 watts. And at this time, I've only connected 1. And then again, I have the removable flash media, which at this time is absent. And finally, I have USB management. In the front of my server, next to the LEDs, I have 2 USB ports. In the back, there are 2 USB ports as well. And inside, there's another USB port. However, those 2 front USB ports could be limited only to the iDRAC Direct Connect, or they could be standard for the OS, or I could just leave them in automatic. And we could use this to configure from A to Z our server by providing an XML file. By default, the setting is put like enable only when the server is in default credentials. Currently it's in default credentials, username root, password Calvin, and only in that scenario might it take an XML file to reconfigure everything. Once you have decently configured your server, you should put this on disable and then apply. Now let's have a little look at storage. First, it shows me the number of physical and or virtual disks. It shows me an overview. I have inserted or removed a number of disks. It also shows me whether my disks are in RAID or non-RAID mode. If I go to topology, I have an overview of my system. In the system, I have an HBA330 Mini, I have a backplane, and I have my physical devices. And if I go to my identity, I can see 1 solid disk. And I don't have any pending operations. Now let's look at my physical disks. Currently, it identified 1 solid state disk with all the information it could extract. Depending on the complexity of your system, you might have more or less enclosures and virtual disks. When you have identify, you can have your solid state disk or any other disk blink in order to identify if a disk has an issue. Say you have the 24th disk which is failing, that's easy, that might be at the end. But if you have the 13th, it's a little bit more harder, you need to count correctly, and by that you can just identify it. Next to physical disks, I also have virtual disks. Now this system is non-RAID, and so I can't tweak a lot with that. I've just inserted my 4 SAS drives, and let's have a look again. And now, first of all, I get the inserts, and my physical disks went from 1 to 5. If I have an overview of my topology again, still the same thing. Now my identity, I have 5 disks instead of 1. I still don't have any operations. If I go to my physical disks now, I can see I have one solid state and I have 4 SAS drives. And for each of those SAS drives, I also have information. I still can't set up anything and I can still identify them if I want to. Again, I have no virtual disks. I have my controller. Nothing has changed here. And my enclosure, nothing has changed other than instead of having 1 disk, I now have 5 disks. Now if we have a little look at our Dell R930, which has a per controller, has 16 disks, that's a whole new ball game. And here we have 16 physical disks and 1 virtual disk. If we now look at the topology, we can see that on one side we have a per controller, which is directly connected to the BP13G expansion, and we also have 2 PCIe SSD drives. Again, we can identify and the virtual disk and the physical disk. Here we have a potential pending operation since we have a per controller. We only have 1. Now if we look at our physical disk, you can see we have 16 SAS 1.2 terabyte disks. And again, for each of those disks, you have information. There's still not much setup. You have either your PCI extender or the per controller, and we can still identify them. Now in here, I have 1 virtual disk. Since on my per controller, I created a RAID 5 partition with all of my 16 disks. And so I have a virtual disk. And so depending on how you manipulate your per controller in the different disks, you might have more than 1 virtual disk. Since everything is created here now, I can't really create 1 more. But if there would be spare disks, I would be able to, I can delete, I can change the read or write cache, I can initialize, I can check consistency, and I can identify my virtual disk. I guess if I click this, all disks associated in this virtual disk would stop blinking. And then finally I have my per controller and I have my PCI extender. It provides me with all the information of the PCI extender and with some information about the per controller. Can I do something setup wise? And in setup, I can only configure the per controller. I can switch mode. It's in RAID. I can enable disable patrol read. I can manually patrol read, etc. Some of these options we've already seen in the BIOS menu as well. And next, I have my enclosure, and then next I have 2 PCI extenders, and even though I have 2 disks in them, they're not identified here. And then I have my BP13G with all those disks associated. On my Dell R630, while Proxmox is running, on the host OS, since there's no integration, my network interfaces returns me nothing. If I go to the Dell R930, where I do have Windows running, here I can see all identified network cards. I even see a local loopback from Windows. And I see the IP addresses which are assigned. And I can see there's one up with its local IP address. And so this shows clearly an advantage of having integration between the iDRAC and the host OS. Unfortunately, Proxmox does not at this time provide information yet. That might come later. And finally, I rebooted my Dell R930 to an ESXi. And it's a total different configuration, but again there's integration. And I see my networks connected. So now let's have a look at the iDRAC settings. Well, first, of course, you can change the label which is displayed on the LED screen if your server has one. Not all models have one. The R630 does, the R730 doesn't. But you have a choice between a custom message, your host name, a service tag, the IP address, or the DNS settings. We've already seen those settings somewhere in another screen in the system setting. Next we have some network settings, the MAC address of the iDRAC port, the domain name we associated, and whether or not we have a dedicated NIC or not, depending on whether we are in the enterprise or the express version. And finally we have IPv4 and IPv6 settings for your iDRAC port. If we go to the settings tab, we can change the time zone and NTP server. Again, each of those blocks has an apply button, and if you apply the first, you lose the settings from the second. The network settings tab is a little bit more interesting. First, you can choose whether or not you want to enable the NIC. Next, you can choose for your iDRAC whether or not you choose the dedicated port, or for whatever reason, you could still choose to use one of the other LUMs which is available in your system. There might be multiple scenarios why you don't want to use your dedicated NIC. First, your dedicated NIC might have an issue. Secondly, you might be in a situation where you only have a number of limited uplink ports to your switch. In that case, you could share your LUM4 together with your other network connection. And then if you want, you can still separate the traffic by filling in the VLAN settings. The failover NIC is only available when I first change from dedicated NIC to another LUM. So as a first LUM, I select LUM4, and as my failover network, I can select LUM3. Next we have the settings. In here we have the option to register your iDRAC on your DNS, the DNS iDRAC server on your DNS server. And then depending on whether or not you're using IPv4 DHCP server, I'll leave the autoconfig disabled for now. However, should you want to enable that, you can use the HTTP option 43 and 15 in combination with a TFTP or an HTTP server, which will provide an XML file. Next we have the IPv4 settings, where we can enable them or disable them. We can also enable or disable the HTTP or hardcode an IP address. And the same thing for the IPv6. Next we have the IPMI settings. Here we can decide to enable or disable it. So what is IPMI? IPMI is a standard interface used for out-of-band management. It allows you to reboot, power on, power off the server through a tool and not through this web interface. It allows you to read temperature, fan speed, power supply settings. It allows you to access the log files if you need to, command line based, and it allows you to provision BIOS and RAID settings. Now IPMI is quite old, and if you really need it, it's okay, but you could rather do stuff with RAC-admin or with Redfish, which are more modern, more secure. If you look at the channel privilege settings here from the start, you can decide what your IPMI can do. In administrative mode, it can do everything. In operator mode, it can read settings and it can reboot the server, but it can't change the configuration. In user mode, it can only read temperature and other settings. And then finally, we have the encryption key, which is a session encryption key, which would for each session encrypt it more. On the Dell R630, I haven't really used it, but on the Dell R730 at some point I did use it to lower the speed of my fans. And it's quite easy because I just need to execute an IPMI tool, enter username and password, enter some settings, and my fan speed lowers. Now this is also something that could be done through Redfish or RAC-admin. And then finally we have the VLAN settings. So the next option is the SSL. Well, our iDRAC is running in SSL, but out of the box they have a self-signed certificate from Dell without a certificate chain. We've already seen when we initially started that we had to override it. However, in a home environment where most of these servers these days are used, this is not so much of an issue. However, if you are still using a corporate PC which has some policies in place, connecting to a self-signed certificate and or a not trusted certificate might be an issue, and you might not even be able to connect to it just because your browser doesn't give you the proceed button. Another issue in the future, well, now we're 2025, but this certificate expires in 2026. And once it expires, your browser will behave differently, because before it was just a self-signed certificate, then it will become a self-signed certificate which is also expired. Me personally, I'm still running a Microsoft certificate server, and I try to replace each of those certificates of each of the devices with a trusted certificate in my certification chain. However, on this one, I have not really been able to. I created a certificate with the correct name for it, I've uploaded it, the upload goes as it should, and then after it resets its settings, the device becomes unresponsive. And the only thing I really can do to fix it is to connect screen, keyboard and mouse physically to the machine, go into the BIOS settings and reset the certificate. Otherwise, my UI becomes totally unresponsive. So next, under the Network tab, we have Serial over LAN. In essence, our serial port communication is redirected to a LAN. This can be particularly useful for managing headless servers or doing OS installation. So I've enabled it. I put the baud rate at 150K. I gave it a number of rights. You have administrator, operator and user rights. So the administrator of course has full rights. The operator can perform boot power on using sol, but no configuration changes. And a user can just see status. So when the redirect is enabled, the BIOS will redirect serial output to serial over LAN. And once the OS is booted, it'll depend on whether or not the OS can handle it. My personal point of view is just disable this if you don't really need it. So let's do a quick demo. First, I opened up in the background my virtual console. Then I've opened up command prompt next to it. And here I'm going to start the IPMI tool with the username, password, hostname, and with the command sol active. And let's try it out. I'll first call it. So now technically my session is active. And now I'll power on the server and see what happens. As you can see, at some point I start receiving inputs on both sides, on the physical screen and on the override. And so now here my sol is working. And at some point Proxmox is not transmitting anymore, and it stops working. But there might even be an option for Proxmox to even enable it. And so this is a working demo of Sol. So now let's look at the iDRAC settings network services. This is the nitty and gritty details about the iDRAC itself. The first block, local configuration. Disable iDRAC local configuration using the iDRAC settings. In essence, when we enable that, we won't be able to change the iDRAC settings to the F2 BIOS system setup menu. The iDRAC configuration utility won't work either. If you have an LCD panel, you won't be able to change anything anymore either, and possible auto tools will be disabled as well. But the web menu like this will keep working. Now let's look at the web server settings. We can enable it or disable it. If we disable it, this iDRAC web server, which you're currently on, won't be working anymore. We can see we have one active session and we have a maximum of 8 parallel active sessions. We have a timeout of 1800 seconds and we can change both the HTTP and the HTTPS port to something non-standard, should the need be there. And finally we can tweak our SSL. We can switch from 128 to 256 and we can switch TLS 1.1 to TLS 1.2. The higher this is, the better of course, but with all the browsers that might not always have been supported. And then finally we have the custom cipher string. Here we have a little pop-up where we could decide which cipher to use. For now I haven't played with that yet since my custom SSL certificate isn't working. Maybe I'll try to tweak that in the future. But in essence it allows you to harden security. So here we can enable or disable the SSH, we can change the timeout again, and we can change the port number. If we disable SSH, the local OS rackadmin version will still work, the rackadmin version via SSH won't work anymore, and the HTTPS rackadmin version will still work. Same thing for Telnet, with the difference that the SSH is enabled by default and that Telnet is disabled by default, because Telnet is considered less secure. The remote rackadmin allows us to enable and disable rackadmin in remote actions. This is both an SSH and HTTPS. The local version running on the OS will still work. Next we have the SNMP agent, which we can enable or disable. If we disable this, remote systems won't be able to access SNMP controls and try to access your system. If you leave it enabled, probably choose something else than public and switch to SNMP v3 because v1 and v2 are quite insecure. And you can also change the port assigned. Next we have the automated system recovery agent. This works in conjunction with the settings we've seen previously. If iDRAC detects that your OS system has crashed, based on the other settings, your host OS will be rebooted. Next we can enable or disable Redfish. Since it's HTTPS, there's nothing else to configure, and it will take all the other settings we've already done in the web server if you want to use another port. And finally, the iDRAC server also includes a VNC server. If for whatever reason the current system with the virtual console is not enough, well, you can configure, enable it, set a password, set a number of settings, configure the port, and you can take over control of your iDRAC remotely. The last step in the networking section is our OS to iDRAC pass-through. This needs to be enabled to either LAN or USB NIC for our host OS to be able to communicate directly to iDRAC and rackadmin. On my Dell R630, this is disabled since there's no communication possible between Proxmox and server. On my Dell R930, this is enabled since it's running Windows and ESXi. Depending on your already complex or not so complex network configuration, the LAN option, where you specify the host IP, might be better, but that's up to you. And finally, there's a simple button to test the network configuration. When connecting on my Windows server, here we can see we have an unidentified network which is using the remote and disk compatible device with no internet access. If we look in detail through ipconfig/all, here we see the Ethernet adapter, which is a remote and disk compatible device, and it has an IP address of 169.254.0.3. And so the communication between the host and the iDRAC is established. So the next block is user authentication. As you can see here, iDRAC out of the box supports 16 different users. The only user which is enabled is a root user with admin rights. Then at the bottom we have the default password warning. If our user is using default Kelvin, we'll get a warning. We've already seen that at the start. We can override that on the logon screen, but we can also override that here. Once your system is correctly configured, you will never be using Kelvin, and so whether or not you're enabled or disabled is just a detail. Now let's click on User 2. The first block allows us to configure user details. The second block is to play around with smart card configuration, and I have no experience with that, so I'll skip that for now. And the third block for each of those users allows us to upload SSH keys. Now the SSH keys use PKI, public-private key. You upload the public key to the iDRAC and you keep your private key. And in essence, instead of using the username password to log in, there's a key communication private to public, and so you can log in. There's benefits to using that. There's improved security. You avoid password-based logins, and it's more resistant to brute force attack. It's much easier for scripting and automation, and each user has its specific key. Now let's configure the user details. As we can see, we have user 2. The user is enabled. All the other users are disabled. We can change the username if we choose to. We can change the password if we want to. The next block is the IPMI privileges. In the Network tab, we've already seen that we can assign general IPMI privileges. We can choose for administrator, we can choose for operator, we can choose for user or none. First, we can have the maximum level which is authorized for IPMI, but then here per user we can still enable or disable, upgrade or downgrade its rights. Now if on the Network tab there's only user rights, this one won't be able to override. However, if on the Network tab we have administrator, we can still limit user rights for IPMI here. And the separate rights for either LAN access and for serial port access. And as well we can enable or disable serial over LAN, as was shown before. In the network configuration we've already seen to enable or disable SNMP access. SNMP v1 and v2 is anonymous. For SNMP v3 you need to authenticate. Here per user we can assign the right whether or not that user has the right to log in through SNMP v3. And then what authentication type it can use, MD5 or SHA, and privacy type, DES or AES. And finally, a most important block here is the iDRAC privileges. Root, out of the box, has everything. But you can create a number of other users which have less privileges, whether or not they can configure logins, whether or not they can access configuration, whether or not they can access user configuration, logs files, system controls, access the console, access the virtual media, operate system, and debug. And finally, if you want to change that, we choose apply. I'm quickly setting up a test user to see what the rights are. If I select my role of none, all flags are unflagged, but I can still specifically override those. If I set it on read-only mode, I can only log in. If I set it on operator mode, everything with the exception of configuring user and logs are enabled, and administrator has full rights. So first go for read-only mode. Now let's log in with our test user and see what it can do. At this point it only has login rights. And so as you can see, I have no access to the virtual console. I cannot reboot. I can still see the logs. I have no apply button for the settings. I can't change my power configuration. I can't change anything attached media. Again here, everything is read-only. I can't go into user details. However, I can see the users. I can see the drives. I've reconnected as root. And I'll upgrade. I'll give it operator rights. I'm logging out again. I'm logging in again. And I do have my virtual console. I can power on and off. But if I go to my user settings, I cannot do anything. And so there's a number of other options we can play, but I'll stop here right now. Something which does annoy me is that once you have created a user, I have not really found a way to remove that user. I can disable it, but when I go into detail, I cannot remove the user. So if it's test user, I don't care, but if it's John Doe, whatever, that's more an issue. If I do back and I try to do apply, I get an error that the user can't be empty. So, other than doing a full iDRAC reset, I don't see another way to remove that user. The next stop is the directory services. And here you can choose between Microsoft Active Directory and a generic LDAP directory service. If you're like me and you have dozens of racks filled with 42 Dell R630s, all being managed by different persons, while controlling that locally on the iDRAC user menu, it's quite hard. Okay, I'm joking, but in general, in larger corporations, managing the rights through Microsoft Active Directory or another LDAP is much more feasible than managing server per server. The last thing you want is to have 10 servers with the same root password and then somebody leaving and you need to go individually to all of those 10 servers to change the password, or 100. Or even more. So let's try to set up Microsoft Active Directory. So when clicking through to Active Directory Configuration and Management, you arrive on this screen. You have a number of blocks, you have the common settings, you have Active Directory CA certificate, you have whether or not to use an extended schema or not, you have the standard schema setup, and you have a number of groups. And basically everything is read-only here. And the only way to configure it is to go to Configure Active Directory. First, you can choose whether or not to provide certificates. Me personally, I haven't done that, but in a real setup, it will be better to provide the certificates to probably go to the SSL version instead of the non-SSL version. That makes things more secure. Then next, I have to enable Active Directory, I have to enable single sign-on, I have to provide a domain name, and I have to provide one or more fully qualified domain names or IP addresses of my domain controller. I have filled in one, but in a real-life environment you'll have at least 2 or 3. The next block, we can choose to have extended or standard schema. I chose a standard for now. If you go to the extended schema, you have a lot more options. Dell can add custom specific attributes on your AD objects. It allows for richer control of object-based management, and it does require schema modifications, so think carefully. So click Next. In general, the global catalog servers are the same as what you've provided before, unless you're in a big corporate environment where you might have dozens of Active Directories, then they might vary. And finally here we can define 5 different groups of people who have access with their own privileges. For now, I just specified one. I create one role group where, for instance, I give all my domain users of my domain access to the administrator. But if we go into detail, we can specify the group name, we can specify the domain name, and the same thing we saw with the admin rights before. We can choose administrator, which selects all, we can choose operator, which selects only partial, or read-only. And so we can create different profile groups for each of the users. And then finally, we finalize our configuration. And as you can see here, instead of my local domain, this iDRAC, I have my domain. And I entered a specific user I created for this and a password, and I connect. And I'm connected to my domain user. As you can see here, iDRAC add with admin rights. And the final tab, Smart Card, under the user authentication, allows you to configure smart cards. But since I don't have any experience nor have any smart card, I'll skip this one. Next we arrive at the update and rollbacks. Me personally, I've never had to roll back a patch, but this is the part where you can update each of your individual components through a web interface. I already made a video on how to do the same thing through the Lifecycle Manager. This, from my point of view, is more practical. If you have a local, you can first download yourself the patch and then through Browse, update the local file and have it update. Same thing, you can do through Network Share, and there you provide a KIFS or an NFS share, and it can pick up the files it needs. FTP used to be a thing, but as far as I understood now, or you have your own FTP server and then you can provide updates that way as well, but the Dell FTP server has become obsolete. Same thing, next to FTP, we could use TFTP to retrieve and the files and the catalog, or HTTP, which is also obsolete unless you provide your own site and you clone it, but the version which still works is HTTPS. And then you just provide downloads.dell.com, you do for check for updates, and so after a while he responds there's nothing to update. Firmware versions on the server match the catalog, applicable updates are not present in this repo. Don't forget that this server is out of support, and I've already updated everything to the latest version. However, if you get your hands on an older server which has not been updated, this can still work. Now there's also a section Automatic Updates, where you could schedule and automatically have him find and retrieve updates. Personally, on a server which is running in production, for me that's a no-go. You want to be in control at all times when and if you upload a patch. And the next block is a rollback. For instance, here I could roll back my iDRAC to the previous version. The iDRAC server profiles allows us to backup and restore a configuration. We have the backup and export, and we have the import. In the backup block, first we need to specify a file name, an encryption key, and then we can choose whether or not we have a KIFS or an FS share, where we need to provide an IP address, share name, domain name, username and password. And we can also choose to have the automatic backup, for instance to back it up once a day, a week, a month. And afterwards the import process is not automated, but once we have backupped it somewhere we could restore it, should we have screwed up the configuration. And finally, I can see the sessions. Currently I see there's 2 sessions open and I could choose to terminate one. Now those are both root, but for whatever reason, if you see other users and if for whatever reason they need to be ejected, you can just terminate them. And they're gone. A little port scan on the iDRAC showed us the following open ports: HTTP, HTTPS, 22, which is SSH, and port 5900, which is used for the old way to connect to the iDRACs. Now let's say I'm a hacker and I want to brute force this iDRAC, so I can try a number of passwords. And after my third try, I already need to wait for 60 seconds. So that's good, it slows things down. And after 60 seconds, I can try again. So if I go to log and I go to the lifecycle controller, there I can clearly see a user attempt has been made and has been blocked for 60 seconds, which is quite good. Now let's try the same hacking through IPMI. First a successful command, and that one is working. Now let's tweak the password, and this should fail. Try a second time, try the third time, try a fourth time. We can clearly see that we have a different message after the fifth try. So I guess it's the same kind of blocking who's in place. Now let's return to our web interface and see if we see something. And here we do see that there were some IPMI sessions which were logged on and logged off, but somehow it did not detect our hacking attempt. So now let's try the same with RACadmin, and the first one will succeed. And now let's brute force, and this one will fail. After the third try, it takes a lot more time to respond. So RACadmin is secured correctly. I guess I have the same timeout of 60 seconds I had before. And so it finally failed. Now do a successful again. And it's working again. And here again we have a login attempt from RACadmin that failed, and it's clearly logged. This concludes the in-depth review of the Dell 13th Gen iDRAC settings. This is really a must-have for any server management. Other than any hardware issues, once you got this, you can do everything remotely. If you guys enjoyed this content, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.